On a distant planet where glowing forests pulse with life and crimson veins on pearlescent skin whisper ancient secrets, Elias Caron, an archaeologist from a shattered Earth, stumbles into a fate he never imagined. A stone tablet that could rewrite human history, a deadly attack at a scientific summit, and a single touch from a mysterious woman with living hair that sends shivers racing through his veins. Is it love, or a conspiracy spanning two species? This mystery will drag you into a journey you can't escape, where desire is restrained, danger lurks in every shadow, and the truth hides where no one dares to tread. If you're dying to find out what Elias and Cirith face in the strange world of Zyra, don't miss out. Subscribe now, so you won't miss a single twist of this tale. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join me on this adventure. The sky above Earth was a dull, ash-choked gray, a perpetual shroud that had hung over the planet for centuries since the cataclysmic wars. Elias Caron stood on the cracked tarmac of the makeshift launch site, his lean silhouette framed against the skeletal remains of a once great city. The wind tugged at his dark brown hair, now streaked with dust, and carried the faint tang of rust and decay. At 32, Elias was no stranger to desolation. He'd spent his life sifting through it, a self-taught archaeologist driven by an insatiable hunger to uncover the secrets of humanity's forgotten past. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of digging through rubble, gripped the multi-tool at his belt, a sleek device that hummed faintly with latent energy. It wasn't just a tool. It was his lifeline, a compact marvel of post-apocalyptic engineering capable of scanning, shielding, and cutting through nearly anything. Today, it would carry him beyond Earth to a world that might hold the answers he'd chased for over a decade. The ship waiting for him was a relic itself, patched together from salvaged parts, its hull dented but sturdy. Elias ran a hand along its side, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. The journey to Zyra wasn't sanctioned by any official body. Earth's fractured government had little interest in funding expeditions beyond their crumbling borders, but Elias had bartered, scavenged, and called in every favor he had to make it happen. Rumors of an ancient stone tablet, etched with symbols hinting at humanity's contact with an alien race millennia ago, had haunted his dreams. If it existed, it could rewrite everything humanity knew about itself. With a final glance at the desolate horizon, he climbed aboard, the engines roaring to life as the ship shuddered and lifted off, piercing the ash-laden sky toward the stars. The journey took 3 weeks, a blur of hyperspace jumps and restless nights spent poring over fragmented data logs. When Zyra finally appeared on the ship's cracked view screen, Elias felt his breath catch. The planet glowed like a living jewel, its surface a tapestry of bioluminescent forests pulsing with soft green light, interwoven with sprawling cities that seemed to grow organically from the landscape. Unlike Earth's sterile ruin, Zyra teemed with life, alien, vibrant, and utterly foreign. As the ship descended, Elias glimpsed towering structures of biomaterial, their smooth curves glistening like wet stone under the light of twin suns. The air, when he stepped out onto the landing platform, was thick with the sweet, resinous scent of the forest, a stark contrast to the acrid bite he'd grown accustomed to back home. He adjusted the worn leather strap of his satchel, the multi-tool clipped securely to his belt, and took in his surroundings. The landing site buzzed with activity. Zyran workers with shimmering, pearl-like skin moved with fluid grace, their voices a melodic hum that danced on the edge of human hearing. Elias felt out of place in his dusty expedition gear, a simple jacket and trousers patched from years of wear, but he squared his shoulders and pressed forward. He'd been invited to a scientific symposium by a Zyran contact he'd met through a back-channel trade network, a cryptic message promising insight into the tablet he sought. The symposium was his entry point, and he intended to make the most of it. The auditorium was a marvel of Zyran architecture, its walls glowing with a soft, shifting light that mimicked the forest outside. Hundreds of Zyrans filled the space, their skin catching the illumination in a way that made them seem almost translucent. Elias slipped into a seat near the back, his human presence drawing curious glances but little overt attention. He scanned the room, noting the intricate patterns etched into the walls, spirals and curves that hinted at a culture far older than humanity's recorded history. Then, the crowd's murmur faded, and she stepped onto the central platform. Cirith Valera was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Her skin wasn't the silver of her kin, but a pearlescent sheen that shimmered with an otherworldly luster, threaded with vivid red veins of light that pulsed faintly across her body. They traced delicate paths along her arms, dipped low across her collarbone, and flared wider as they curved over her hips, accentuating every line of her form in a way that was both hypnotic and dangerously alluring. Her hair, a cascade of black shot through with crimson streaks, moved as if alive, coiling and unfurling around her shoulders with a mind of its own. The garment she wore, a skin-tight suit of biomaterial, hugged her like a second skin, its translucent patches at the shoulders and waist revealing glimpses of those glowing veins without crossing into indecency. Her eyes, twin pools of emerald rimmed with a fiery red halo, locked onto the audience with an intensity that made Elias's pulse quicken despite himself. "I stand before you today," Cirith began, her voice a low, resonant melody that seemed to vibrate through the air, to propose a radical truth. Our species is dying. Our genetic purity, once our pride, has become our prison. But there is hope. Evidence suggests that ancient humans, a species we dismissed as primitive, once crossed our path. Their DNA could be the key to our survival. The room erupted in whispers, some sharp with indignation, others tinged with intrigue. Elias leaned forward, his archaeologist's mind racing. She was talking about his tablet, or something damn close to it. Cirith paced the platform, her movements fluid and deliberate, the red veins on her skin flaring brighter with each step. Her hair shifted, tendrils curling outward as if reaching for the audience, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that she was aware of every eye on her, maybe even his. "I've spent years studying the anomalies in our genetic code," she continued, "and I believe a hybridization event occurred thousands of years ago. We can replicate it. We must if Zyra is to endure." The murmurs grew louder, a few voices rising in protest, but Cirith pressed on, undeterred, her confidence radiating like heat. Elias was so caught up in her words that he almost missed the shift in the air, a faint, high-pitched whine that his human ears barely registered. His hand instinctively dropped to the multi-tool, years of survival instinct kicking in. From the shadowed edge of the auditorium, a flash of light erupted, and 3 glowing lances streaked towards Cirith. The crowd gasped, but Elias was already moving, his boots pounding the floor as he sprinted toward her. "Get down," he shouted, thumbing the multi-tool shield function. A shimmering blue barrier snapped into existence just as the first lance struck, deflecting it with a crackle of energy. The second lance slipped through a gap in the shield's arc, slicing into his shoulder with a searing jolt of pain. He grunted, stumbling forward, and the third grazed his arm, leaving a shallow burn. He hit the ground hard, the shield flickering out as his vision swam. Cirith dropped to her knees beside him, her hands catching his shoulders before he could collapse completely. Up close, she was even more striking. Those red veins pulsed brighter, radiating warmth where her fingers pressed against his jacket. Her hair coiled around his wrist, soft but insistent, as if claiming him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice softer now, laced with a tremor of concern. Elias gritted his teeth against the pain, meeting her gaze. Her emerald eyes, ringed with that fiery red, bored into him, and the heat from her touch sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the wound. "I'll live," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. Her fingers lingered on his arm, the glowing veins flaring where they brushed his skin, and he felt an inexplicable pull, something primal, magnetic, that made his breath hitch. The crowd surged around them, shouts echoing as security drones whirred overhead. But for a moment, It was just the two of them, locked in a silent exchange that felt far more dangerous than the lances still smoking on the floor. Siritha's lips parted, a faint flush darkening the red of her veins, and Elias knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was no ordinary meeting. Whatever had just begun between them, it was going to change everything. The world came back to Elias Quran in fragments. First the dull throb in his shoulder where the glowing lance had bitten into flesh, then the faint hum of machinery somewhere nearby, and finally a scent that was utterly alien, sharp, floral, with an undercurrent of something warm and earthy. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly, and found himself lying face down on a smooth, curved surface that pulsed faintly beneath him. It wasn't metal or stone, but something organic, warm to the touch, like the skin of a living thing. His jacket had been stripped off, leaving him in a thin undershirt, and a cool sensation spread across his wounded shoulder, easing the pain into a distant ache. He shifted slightly, testing his body, and a soft voice cut through the haze. "Don't move too quickly. Your physiology is resilient, but the venom in those lances isn't trivial." The voice was familiar, melodic yet precise, and Elias turned his head to see Sirith Valera kneeling beside him. Her pearlescent skin shimmered in the dim light of what he now realized was an underground chamber, its walls lined with glowing vines that cast a greenish hue over everything. Those vivid red veins threading her body pulsed faintly, brighter where her hands hovered over his back, applying a translucent salve that tingled against his skin. Her hair, black with crimson streaks, alive and restless, swayed gently, a few tendrils curling toward him as if curious. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd been on that symposium stage, and Elias felt a flush creep up his neck that he couldn't entirely blame on the venom. "Where am I?" he rasped, his throat dry. He pushed himself up on one elbow, ignoring the protest from his shoulder, and caught her gaze. Her emerald eyes, ringed with that fiery red halo, studied him with an intensity that made his pulse stutter. The suit she wore clung to her like liquid, its translucent patches at her shoulders and waist revealing glimpses of those glowing veins, and Elias had to force himself to focus on her face instead of the way the light played across her curves. "My private lab," Sirith replied, her lips curving into a faint, almost amused smile. "Beneath the symposium hall. I couldn't exactly leave you bleeding out in front of the entire scientific council, could I? Not after you threw yourself into harm's way for me." Her fingers paused over his shoulder, the red veins flaring briefly where they brushed his skin, and Elias tensed at the unexpected warmth that radiated from her touch. It wasn't just heat. It was something electric, a sensation that danced along his nerves and made him acutely aware of how close she was. "Guess I didn't think that part through," he said, managing a wry grin despite the ache. "Instinct, mostly. You were in trouble." He shifted again, sitting up fully now, and Sirith leaned back slightly, giving him space, but not much. Her hair coiled inward, then flared out again, one tendril brushing his wrist before retreating, and he couldn't tell if it was intentional or just another quirk of her alien biology. Either way, it sent a shiver up his arm that he tried to ignore. "Instinct," she echoed, tilting her head as if testing the word. "A fascinating trait. Zyrans don't often act without calculation. Perhaps that's why we're stagnating." She stood, her movements fluid and graceful, and Elias couldn't help but notice how the biosuit hugged her form, accentuating the flare of her hips and the subtle strength in her legs. The red veins pulsed brighter for a moment, as if responding to her shift in posture, and he tore his gaze away, focusing instead on the room around them. The lab was a blend of nature and technology unlike anything he'd seen on Earth. The floor rippled faintly, as if breathing, and the walls were studded with crystalline nodes that glowed softly, illuminating shelves of strange instruments and vials filled with luminescent liquids. A holographic display hovered in one corner, projecting swirling patterns that Elias recognized as genetic sequences, human and Zyran, side by side. It was a scientist's sanctuary, hidden beneath the bustling surface of Zyra, and it spoke volumes about Sirith's status and her secrets. "You're a human," she said, drawing his attention back to her. She crossed her arms, the motion making the veins along her forearms glow briefly, and Elias had to remind himself to breathe. "Elias Karan, if my scans are correct, your identification chip was rudimentary but functional. What brings a man like you to Zyra? You're not a diplomat or a traitor. Your gear suggests something else." He rubbed the back of his neck, wincing as the motion tugged at his wound. "Archaeologist," he said simply. "I study the past, ours, and sometimes others. I came here looking for a stone tablet, something old enough to predate human spaceflight. Rumor says it's tied to your species, maybe proof we've met before." He watched her reaction closely, expecting skepticism, but her eyes widened slightly, the red halos flaring with interest. "The Concord tablet," she murmured, almost to herself. She turned away, pacing toward the hologram, and Elias caught the way her hair shifted, tendrils curling inward as if mirroring her thoughts. "I've heard of it. Whispers in the archives, dismissed as myth by most. If it exists, it could validate everything I've been saying." She glanced back at him, her expression a mix of excitement and something else, something that made the air between them feel charged. "You risked your life for me, Elias Karan, and now it seems our paths align. Tell me more." He stood, testing his balance, and found the pain had dulled to a manageable throb, thanks to whatever she'd applied. "Not much to tell yet," he said, stepping closer to the hologram. "Just fragments, old texts, carvings from Earth's ruins. They mention a starborn kin who came before the collapse. I figured Zyra was a good place to start digging." He paused, meeting her gaze again, and this time he didn't look away. "Looks like I found more than I bargained for." Sirith's smile returned, sharper this time, and she closed the distance between them with a single, deliberate step. "Indeed you have," she said, her voice dropping to a lower register that sent a ripple of heat through him. Her hair flared out, one tendril grazing his cheek before retreating, and he froze, caught between the urge to step back and the inexplicable pull to lean closer. "You're not what I expected from a human. Most of your kind who come here are brash, loud, traitors, or mercenaries. You're quieter, curious. Curiosity's kept me alive," he replied, his tone dry but his eyes locked on hers. "That, and knowing when to duck." Her laugh was soft, almost musical, and it did things to his chest he wasn't ready to analyze. She reached out, her fingers hovering over his injured shoulder, and the red veins on her hand glowed brighter, casting a faint light across his skin. "Then we'll need that curiosity," she said, her touch feather-light as she adjusted the salve's placement. "Because if the tablet is real, it's dangerous knowledge. Those lances weren't random. Someone wants my research silenced, and now you're part of it." Her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, the warmth seeping into him, and Elias felt his breath catch. He wasn't sure if it was the venom, the salve, or just her, but his skin prickled where she touched, a sensation that was equal parts alien and intoxicating. "Then we'd better move fast," he said, stepping back to break the spell, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "If they're willing to kill you in public, they won't stop now." Sirith nodded, her hair settling back around her shoulders, but the glow in her veins didn't fade. It pulsed steadily, as if mirroring the tension that hung between them. She gestured toward a narrow tunnel at the far end of the lab. "There's a transport waiting. We can't stay here. They'll track us soon enough. I have a safe site in the Lumery Forest, a place even the Council doesn't know about." She paused, her eyes flicking over him, taking in his disheveled state with a look that was half concern, half something else. "Can you walk?" "Try me," he said, managing a grin despite the ache. He followed her to the tunnel, watching the way her suit shifted with each step, the translucent patches catching the light and drawing his eye to the curve of her waist, the glow of her veins. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't the time, not with assassins on their tail and a mystery bigger than both of them unfolding. But as Sirith glanced back, her lips parting in a knowing smile. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead, it was going to test more than just his survival skills. The tunnel led to a sleek, pod-like vehicle that hummed with energy, its surface rippling like the lab's floor. Sirith slid into the driver's seat with a grace that made Elias pause, her hair coiling around the controls as if guiding them. He climbed in beside her, the space tight enough that their shoulders brushed, and the heat from her skin, or those damn veins, seeped into him again. "Hold on," she said, her voice low and teasing, and the pod surged forward, plunging them into the dark unknown of Zyra's depths. Elias gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing with questions about the tablet, the attack, and the woman beside him whose every move seemed designed to unravel him, one glowing pulse at a time. The pod sliced through the underground tunnels with a low, resonant hum, its bioorganic walls flexing faintly as it navigated the twisting passages beneath Zyra's surface. Elias Caron gripped the edge of his seat, the vibrations thrumming through his hands as he stole a glance at Sirith Valera beside him. Her pearlescent skin caught the dim glow of the pod's interior, those vivid red veins pulsing in rhythm with the vehicle's motion, or perhaps with her own heartbeat, he couldn't tell. Her hair, alive with its crimson-streaked tendrils, coiled around the controls, guiding the pod with an eerie precision that spoke of a connection he couldn't quite grasp. The tight space forced their shoulders to brush with every slight turn, and each fleeting contact sent a jolt through him, a mix of warmth and something electric that made his skin prickle. He told himself it was the aftershock of the venom, but the way her lips curved faintly when she caught him staring suggested she knew better. "How far to this forest?" he asked, his voice rough from the lingering ache in his shoulder. He shifted, trying to put a fraction more space between them, but the pod's design didn't allow for it. Sirith's suit, sleek and translucent in places, shifted with her movements, drawing his eye to the glowing veins that traced her collarbone and dipped lower, disappearing beneath the fabric in a way that made his throat tighten. He forced his gaze forward, focusing on the tunnel's shimmering walls instead. "The Lumari Forest is an hour's journey," she replied, her tone smooth and melodic, carrying that undercurrent of amusement he was starting to recognize. "It's deep within Zyra's core biosphere, hidden from the Council's scanners. My father built this site years ago, a refuge for his unorthodox research." Her fingers danced across the controls, and a tendril of her hair brushed Elias's arm, soft and deliberate, before retreating. He tensed, the sensation lingering like a whisper against his skin, as she tilted her head slightly, her emerald eyes flicking toward him. "You're still in pain, aren't you?" "It's manageable," he said, flexing his shoulder to prove it. The salve she'd applied had dulled the worst of it, but a faint burn remained, a reminder of a lance that had nearly ended him. "I've had worse digging through Earth's ruins. Venom's new, though. Your people don't mess around." He managed a dry grin, hoping to steer the conversation away from the way her proximity was unraveling his focus. Sirith's laugh was soft, a sound that vibrated through the pod and settled somewhere deep in his chest. "The lances are a relic of our past, ceremonial, mostly, until someone decides they're useful for silencing dissent." She leaned closer, inspecting his shoulder with a clinical air that didn't quite mask the curiosity in her gaze. "Your resilience is remarkable. Most Zyrans would be unconscious for days from that dose. Humans are sturdier than I expected." Her fingers hovered near his wound, the red veins flaring brighter, and Elias felt that same electric heat radiate from her, tugging at something primal he couldn't name. "Sturdy's one way to put it," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "Stubborn's closer. We don't give up easy. Keeps us alive when everything else falls apart." Her eyes met his, the red halos around her pupils glowing faintly, and for a moment, the pod's hum faded into the background. Her hair shifted again, a tendril curling toward his cheek before she pulled it back with a subtle flick of her head, and Elias swallowed hard, breaking the stare. "So, this forest, what's waiting for us?" Sirith straightened, the moment passing as she refocused on the controls. "A sanctuary," she said. "A lab, a greenhouse, an archive, all built into the roots of the lumbery trees. My father studied the intersections of Zyran and alien biology there, including humans. If your tablet exists, traces of it might be in his records. Her voice softened, a rare vulnerability creeping in. He was like you, curious, relentless. It's why I trust you'll understand what we're walking into. The pod slowed, its walls parting to reveal a cavernous chamber where the tunnel opened into the lumbery forest. Elias's breath caught as they emerged into a world of impossible beauty. Towering trees, their trunks translucent and veined with glowing sap, stretched hundreds of feet upward, their canopies a lattice of bioluminescent leaves that bathed everything in a soft, emerald light. Vines hung like curtains, pulsing faintly, and the air was thick with the sweet, heady scent of blooming flora. The pod settled onto a mossy platform, and Sirith stepped out, her hair fanning out as if drinking in the forest's energy. Elias followed, his boots sinking slightly into the living ground, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into a dream or a trap. "This is it," Sirith said, turning to face him. The light caught her skin, making the red veins shimmer like molten threads, and her suit seemed to meld with the surroundings, its translucent patches blending with the forest glow. The heart of Zyra's wilds. No one comes here unless I allow it. She gestured toward a structure half buried in the roots of a massive tree, its walls a seamless blend of crystal and bark. "Gulme, we have work to do." Elias trailed her, his eyes lingering on the sway of her hips as she moved, the veins along her lower back flaring with each step. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the task ahead, but the forest itself seemed to conspire against him. The air was warm, almost sensual, and the faint hum of the trees vibrated through him, amplifying the awareness of Sirith's presence. They entered the lab, a cavernous space filled with holographic displays, shelves of preserved specimens, and a central table where a scanner hummed softly. Sirith approached it, her hair coiling around a control node, and the scanner flared to life, projecting a map of Zyra dotted with ancient sites. "These are my father's findings," she said, leaning over the table, her posture drawing Elias's eye to the curve of her spine where the veins glowed brightest. "Potential locations for artifacts like your tablet. He believed our ancestors met yours, traded, fought, maybe more." She glanced at him, a flicker of mischief in her eyes. "What do you think, Elias? Could our kind have been intimate all those years ago?" He stepped closer, drawn by the question as much as her tone. "Possible," he said, his voice steady despite the heat creeping up his neck. "Earth's oldest myths talk about gods from the sky. Beautiful, powerful, not human. Maybe that was you." He paused, meeting her gaze, and her hair shifted, a tendril brushing his hand where it rested on the table. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, and he saw the red veins on her arm flare in response. "Beautiful," she teased, straightening up but not stepping back. The space between them shrank, the air thick with something unspoken, and Elias felt his pulse quicken. Zyrans don't think in those terms. Beauty is function, symmetry. But I've read your species values it differently. Her fingers traced the edge of the table, dangerously close to his, and the glow of her veins seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "We do," he said, his voice rougher now. "And we're not blind to it, even across species." Her smile widened, sharp and knowing, and for a moment he thought she might close the gap entirely. But she turned away, breaking the tension with a graceful pivot, and gestured to a shelf of data crystals. "Let's start here," she said, her tone brisk again. "Father's logs might point us to the tablet. You take the left stack, I'll handle the right." Elias nodded, grateful for the distraction, and moved to the shelf, his fingers brushing the cool crystals as he pulled one free. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the awareness of her across the room, the rustle of her suit, the occasional flare of her veins when she glanced his way. The forest hum seemed to echo the tension, a living pulse that matched the unspoken current between them. Hours passed, the two of them sifting through logs filled with cryptic notes and faded scans. Elias found references to sky visitors and genetic bridges, tantalizing hints that fueled his hope, but nothing concrete. Sirith moved with quiet efficiency, her hair occasionally reaching out to adjust a crystal or brush a display, and Elias caught himself watching her more than the data. At one point, she leaned over his shoulder to check a scan, her breath warm against his ear, and the red veins on her neck glowed so brightly he could feel their heat. "Anything?" she murmured, her voice a soft caress, and he nearly dropped the crystal in his hand. Maybe," he managed, pointing to a line about a Concord site buried in the forest depths. "Could be a lead." She lingered a moment longer, her hair grazing his cheek, then pulled back with a nod, leaving him breathless and faintly annoyed at how easily she unsettled him. "Good," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Then we'll go deeper tomorrow. For now, rest. I've got a chamber prepped. You'll need your strength." She led him to a small alcove off the lab, its walls lined with soft, glowing moss. Elias sank onto the makeshift bed, exhaustion tugging at him. But as Sirith turned to leave, her silhouette framed by the forest light, he couldn't help but wonder what else this journey would demand, and what it might awaken between them. The Lumari forest pulsed with life as Elias Quran followed Sirith Valera deeper into its glowing depths, the air thick with the sweet, resinous scent of bioluminescent flora. The twin suns of Zyra had dipped below the horizon, leaving the canopy to cast an ethereal green light that danced across the forest floor. Elias adjusted the strap of his satchel, the multi-tool clipped to his belt humming faintly as he scanned their surroundings. The trees here were ancient, their translucent trunks veined with sap that glowed brighter than those near the lab, and their roots twisted into labyrinthine patterns that seemed to shift beneath his boots. It was a world alive in ways Earth's ruins never could be, and yet the weight of history pressed against him, whispering of secrets buried in the soil. Sirith moved ahead, her pearlescent skin shimmering in the forest glow, those vivid red veins threading her body pulsing with a rhythm that matched the hum of the trees. Elias followed, the multi-tool scanner casting a faint blue light as they navigated the twisting steps. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of earth and something metallic, and the walls tightened around them, forcing them into single file. Sirith's silhouette ahead was a study in motion, her hips swaying slightly with each step, the veins along her lower back glowing through the suit's translucent patches. He tried to focus on the scanner's readings, faint energy signatures pulsing below, but her presence filled the space, her hair occasionally brushing the walls and sending faint sparks into the dark. The stairs ended in a chamber carved from the tree's roots, its walls studded with crystalline nodes that flickered to life as they entered, bathing the space in a soft, amber glow. At the center stood a pedestal, and atop it rested the Concord tablet, a slab of biocrystal no larger than a book, its surface shimmering with fractal patterns that shifted like liquid. Elias's breath caught, years of chasing rumors coalescing into this moment. "That's it," he whispered, stepping forward, but Sirith's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she said, her voice low and urgent. Her fingers tightened, the red veins flaring where they pressed against his skin, and Elias felt that electric heat again, sharper this time, radiating up his arm. "It's active, look." She pointed to the tablet, where the patterns pulsed faster, as if sensing their presence. "It's responding already. Your DNA, maybe mine, it knows we're here." He met her gaze, her face inches from his in the tight space, and the glow of her veins illuminated the intensity in her eyes. "Then let's find out what it has to say," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He stepped to the pedestal, Sirith at his side, and reached out, his fingers hovering over the crystal. Her hand joined his, their skin brushing as they touched the surface together, and the tablet flared to life, projecting a holographic cascade of symbols into the air. The display swirled, resolving into two genetic sequences, one Zyran, one human, spiraling around each other in a dance of light. Sirith's breath hitched, her hair flaring outward, and Elias felt her lean closer, her shoulder pressing against his as they watched. "It's a record," she murmured, her voice trembling with awe. "A hybridization event, thousands of years ago. Our ancestors, they merged with yours." The hologram shifted, showing a map of Zyra dotted with sites, then a sequence of images. Zyrans and humans working together, their forms blending in ways that hinted at more than alliance. Elias stared, his mind racing. "They weren't just visitors," he said, tracing the human strand with his eyes. "They stayed, mixed with your people. That's why you're dying now. Too much purity, not enough diversity." He turned to Sirith, their faces close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath, and her veins glowed brighter, casting a faint red light across his features. "Exactly," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "Father was right. They saved us once. We can do it again." Her hand slid from the tablet to his arm, lingering there, and the contact sent a shiver through him, amplified by the forest hum. Her hair coiled toward him, a tendril brushing his jaw, and he froze, caught in the intensity of her gaze. "You're proof, Elias, living proof that it worked." The air between them thickened, charged with the weight of the discovery and something more personal. He could feel the pulse of her veins against his skin, the subtle shift of her suit as she leaned closer. And for a moment, he forgot the tablet, the danger, everything but the way she looked at him, like he was the answer to a question she'd spent her life asking. "Guess we're more connected than I thought," he said, his voice low, and her lips parted, a faint flush darkening the red of her veins. "More than you know," she replied, her tone a mix of challenge and invitation. Her hair flared again, tendrils grazing his neck, and he felt his resolve waver, the urge to close the gap warring with the reality of their situation. But before he could act, the chamber trembled, a low rumble echoing through the roots, and the hologram flickered, replaced by a warning in Zyran script. Sirith pulled back, her expression shifting to alarm. "Intruders," she said, her voice sharp now. "They found us, faster than I expected." She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the stairs, and the sudden contact, her fingers laced with his, her veins flaring, sent a jolt through him that he couldn't ignore. "We need to move. Now." Elias nodded, adrenaline surging as he followed her up the steps, the tablet's secrets burning in his mind, and the heat of her touch lingering on his skin, a promise of more to come, danger or not. The staircase trembled beneath Elias Caron's boots as he raced upward, Sirith Valera's hand still gripping his, her fingers warm and insistent against his skin. The glow of her red veins flared with each step, casting flickering shadows on the root-lined walls, and her hair, alive with crimson-streaked tendrils, trailed behind her like a storm cloud, brushing his arm as they climbed. The forest's hum had shifted, its soothing pulse replaced by a low, discordant rumble that vibrated through his chest, amplifying the adrenaline surging in his veins. The Concord Tablet's revelations burned in his mind, proof of an ancient union between humans and Zyrans. But the warning hologram had snuffed out any chance to process it. Someone or something was coming for them, and fast. "Keep up," Sirith called, her voice sharp but laced with urgency rather than fear. She moved with a grace that belied the situation, her biosuit shifting with each stride, the translucent patches catching the amber light from the chamber below. Elias couldn't help but notice the way the veins along her legs pulsed brighter, accentuating the curve of her calves, and he cursed himself for the distraction. This wasn't the time, not with the ground shaking and the air thickening with threat. He tightened his grip on the multi-tool, its faint hum a reassuring counterpoint to the forest's unrest. They burst into the clearing, the massive trees' glowing roots sprawling around them like a living fortress. The bioluminescent canopy overhead flickered, its emerald light stuttering as if the forest itself sensed the intrusion. Sirith released his hand, her fingers lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary, and Elias felt the absence of her touch like a sudden chill. She spun toward the pod, her hair flaring outward, tendrils reaching for the controls before she even stepped inside. "They've breached the outer perimeter," she said, her eyes scanning a holographic display that materialized above the pod's console. Council enforcers, armed, shielded. They're not here to talk. Elias crouched beside her, peering at the display. Red dots pulsed on a map of the Lumeri forest, converging on their position from multiple angles. How many? He asked, his voice steady despite the tightening in his gut. He'd faced raiders on Earth, scavengers who'd kill for a scrap of tech, but this was different. Organized, alien, and backed by a power he couldn't yet gauge. 20, maybe more, Sirith replied, her tone clipped as she adjusted the pod settings. They're using dampening fields, standard for silencing dissenters. It'll block comms, maybe even your tool scanner. She glanced at him, her emerald eyes rimmed with that fiery red halo, and the glow of her veins seemed to pulse in sync with her words. We can't outrun them in this. We need to fight, or hide. Barely, he admitted, his tone dry, but his gaze steady. Her lips parted, a faint flush darkening the red of her veins, and for a moment, he thought she might lean closer, until a sharp crack echoed through the forest, shattering the tension. They both turned, peering through a gap in the roots as shadows moved beyond the clearing, their forms obscured by the flickering light. Enforcers emerged, their armor gleaming with a dull, metallic sheen, each carrying a staff that crackled with energy. Elias counted 10 in sight, their movements precise and coordinated, and he knew more lurked beyond his view. Conservatives? He whispered, his breath brushing Sirith's ear, and she nodded, her hair grazing his cheek in response. The council's old guard, she murmured, her voice low enough that he felt it more than heard it. They'd rather see Zyra die pure than adapt. My research, your tablet, threatens everything they've built. Her shoulder pressed against his as she adjusted her position, and the warmth of her skin sent a shiver down his spine, clashing with the cold dread in his gut. They'll destroy it if they find us. Then we don't let them, Elias said, his hand tightening on the multi-tool. He scanned the alcove, spotting a narrow crevice where the roots parted, leading deeper into the tree's base. There, can we slip through? He pointed, and Sirith followed his gaze, her hair coiling toward the gap as if testing it. Possibly, she said, shifting to inspect it. The movement brought her closer, her hip brushing his thigh, and the flare of her veins sent a wave of heat through him that he fought to ignore. It's tight, but we're not exactly bulky. She glanced at him, a faint smirk playing on her lips, and Elias couldn't tell if she was teasing or just stating fact. Either way, it didn't help his focus. Tight's my specialty, he shot back, mirroring her tone, and her laugh was a soft, fleeting thing that warmed the cramped space. She slid toward the crevice, her body pressing against his for a moment as she maneuvered, and Elias held his breath, the glow of her veins casting a faint red light across his hands. She slipped through first, her suit catching the light as she vanished into the shadows, and he followed, the roots scraping his shoulders as he squeezed into the narrow passage. The tunnel twisted downward, its walls slick with sap that glowed faintly, guiding their path. Sirith moved ahead, her silhouette a shimmering outline, and Elias kept close, the sound of their breathing mingling with the forest's rumble. They emerged into a smaller chamber, its floor carpeted with moss, and its ceiling studded with crystalline nodes that pulsed erratically, as if agitated by the intruders above. Safe, for now, Sirith said, turning to face him, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Her hair flared, tendrils brushing the walls, and the red veins on her neck glowed brighter, drawing his eye despite the danger. For now, Elias echoed, stepping closer to check her for injuries, a reflex from years of field work. His hand hovered near her arm, and she didn't pull away, her gaze locking on his with an intensity that made his throat tighten. You okay? That was close. I'm fine, she said, her voice softer now, almost a caress. Her hand brushed his as she adjusted her stance, the contact sending a jolt through him, and the glow of her veins seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. You, still breathing, he replied, his tone dry but his eyes steady. Her hair shifted, a tendril grazing his wrist, and he felt the tension between them flare again, sharper now, fueled by the adrenaline of their escape. But before he could say more, the chamber shuddered, a distant explosion rocking the forest above, and Siritha's expression hardened. "They're blasting the roots," she said, pulling back with visible effort. "Trying to flush us out. We need a plan, fast." She moved to a note on the wall, her fingers tracing its surface, and a faint hologram flickered to life, showing the enforcers' positions. Elias joined her, their shoulders brushing as they studied the map, and the heat of her skin lingered, a distraction he couldn't afford but couldn't ignore. "Then let's give them something to chase," he said, his mind racing. He pointed to a cluster of nodes on the map. Energy hubs, if he guessed right. "Can we overload those? Draw them away from the tablet." Siritha's eyes widened, then narrowed with approval, and she nodded, her hair coiling toward him in a gesture that felt almost approving. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "But it'll take both of us, your tool, my knowledge." "Ready." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his again, and Elias felt the stakes rise, not just for the tablet, but for whatever was growing between them, a connection as dangerous as the enforcers hunting them down. "Always," he said, and they set to work, the forest pulse echoing the tension that bound them tighter with every passing second. The Lumari forest trembled as Elias Caron and Sirith Valera worked in tandem, their movements quick and precise despite the chaos closing in. The chamber's crystalline nodes pulsed erratically, casting jagged shadows across the mossy floor, and the air crackled with the distant hum of energy weapons tearing through the forest above. Elias crouched beside a glowing hub, his multi-tool whirring as he adjusted its settings, its blue light cutting through the amber glow of the roots. Sirith knelt across from him, her pearlescent skin shimmering with sweat, those vivid red veins flaring brighter with every breath. Her hair, black with crimson streaks, coiled around the node's controls, interfacing with the forest biotech in a way that still baffled him, tendrils moving with a life of their own. "Almost there," she said, her voice tight but steady as she tapped a sequence into the node. Her biosuit clung to her, its translucent patches catching the light and drawing Elias's eye to the curve of her waist, the glow of her veins pulsing in sync with the forest's unrest. He forced his focus back to the multi-tool, channeling its energy output into the hub. The plan was simple but risky. Overload the forest's energy hubs to create a cascade of false signals, luring the enforcers away from the Concord Tablets chamber. If it worked, they'd buy time to escape. If it didn't, they'd be cornered like rats in a trap. "Ready on my end," Elias replied, his tone clipped as he fine-tuned the tool's frequency. He glanced at Sirith, catching the intensity in her emerald eyes, the red halos around her pupils glowing with a fierce determination that matched his own. Her hair brushed his hand as she leaned closer to check his work, the soft, electric contact sending a jolt through him, and he gritted his teeth against the distraction. "Tell me this'll work." "It'll work," she said, her lips curving into a faint, defiant smile. "Zyron tech bends to intent. It's why we've lasted this long." Her fingers grazed his wrist as she adjusted the node, the heat from her veins radiating through him, and Elias felt his pulse quicken, a mix of adrenaline and something deeper fueling his focus. "On 3, 1, 2, 3, he finished, and they activated their devices in unison. The hub flared, a surge of green light rippling through the roots, and the chamber shuddered as the energy cascade began. Above, a series of muffled explosions echoed, the forest hum spiking into a discordant wail. Siritha's hair flared outward, tendrils sparking as the overload took hold, and Elias shielded his eyes against the sudden brightness, catching the way her veins glowed like molten threads against her skin. "It's working," she breathed, standing to peer through a gap in the roots. Elias joined her, their shoulders brushing in the tight space, and the warmth of her body pressed against his scent and he shivered down his spine, clashing with the cold rush of danger. Through the gap, they saw the enforcers scatter, their armored forms pivoting toward the false signals erupting across the forest, staffs crackling as they fired into the trees. "They're splitting. Half are chasing the decoys. Half still too many, Elias muttered, scanning the clearing. The pod remained cloaked, its camouflage holding for now, but the remaining enforcers were closing in, their movements methodical despite the chaos. He tightened his grip on the multi-tool, switching it to its cutting mode. We need to take them out, quietly if we can. Sirith nodded, her hair coiling inward as if preparing for battle. Follow my lead, she said, slipping out of the alcove with a grace that belied the stakes. Elias trailed her, his boots silent on the moss, and they moved through the shadows of the roots, the forest's glow masking their approach. The enforcers, 6 in sight, fanned out, their staffs sweeping the area, and Elias spotted a straggler near a glowing trunk, isolated from the pack. He gestured to Sirith, and she nodded, her hair flaring briefly before she darted forward, a blur of light and motion. Elias followed, his multi-tool humming as he closed the distance. Sirith reached the enforcer first, her hand pressing against its armor where a node pulsed. Her veins flared, and the enforcer stiffened, a faint crackle of energy shorting its systems. Elias lunged, the tool's blade slicing through the staff's power core, and the enforcer collapsed, silent and still. They dragged it behind the trunk, Sirith's breath quick and shallow as she met his gaze. One down, she whispered, her voice a low thrill that sent a ripple through him. Her hair brushed his arm as she straightened, the tendrils lingering a moment longer than necessary, and Elias felt the tension between them flare, sharper now, fueled by the fight. 5 to go. They moved again, a lethal dance through the forest shadows. Sirith's knowledge of Zyran physiology guided their strikes, disabling armor nodes, targeting joints, while Elias's human ingenuity turned the multi-tool into a weapon of precision, cutting and shielding in equal measure. Each takedown brought them closer, their movements syncing with an instinct that felt older than the forest itself. At one point, Sirith stumbled, an enforcer's staff grazing her arm, and Elias caught her, his hands on her waist as he pulled her behind a root. Her veins glowed fiercely where he touched, the heat seeping through her suit, and she pressed against him, her breath warm against his neck. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice husky, and Elias felt his resolve waver, the urge to hold her tighter warring with the fight still raging. Her hair coiled around his wrist, soft but possessive, and he released her with effort, nodding toward the last 2 enforcers. "Anytime," he said, his tone rougher than he intended. They split, flanking the pair, and the forest erupted in a final clash. Sirith's swift disablement, Elias's brutal efficiency, and then silence fell, broken only by the hum of the trees and their ragged breathing. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, scanning the clearing as Sirith approached, her hair settling back around her shoulders, the red veins pulsing steadily now. "That's all of them," she said, her eyes locking on his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "For now, but they'll send more, once they realize the tablet's still here." "Then we need to move it," Elias said, stepping toward the pod. But Sirith grabbed his arm, her grip firm, and the sudden contact, her fingers warm, her veins flaring, stopped him cold. He turned, meeting her gaze, and saw something new in her eyes. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something you need to know, something I didn't expect, not this soon." She released him, her hand drifting to her stomach, and the red veins there glowed brighter, a subtle pulse that drew his eye. "I'm kidding. A child, ours. Human and Zyran, fused perfectly." Elias froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. His mind raced, piecing together the moments, their closeness, the forest's energy, the tablet's revelations, and landed on a truth he hadn't dared consider. "Ours?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near hers, and the glow of her veins seemed to beckon him, a silent confirmation of the impossible. "Yes," she said, her smile radiant despite the danger. "I felt it days ago, after we synced with the tablet. Your DNA, mine, it triggered something, accelerated it. The forest's energy must have catalyzed it." Her hair flared, tendrils brushing his face, and Elias felt a surge of awe, fear, and something fiercer, pride, maybe love, coiling in his chest. He touched her hand, his fingers brushing the glowing veins on her stomach, and the warmth there was unlike anything he'd felt. Alive, vibrant, a piece of them both. A kid, he said, a grin breaking through despite the chaos. Guess we're rewriting more than history. Her laugh was soft, a sound that cut through the tension, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his, the heat of her skin grounding him. "We are," she murmured, her voice a promise. "But we can't stay here. They'll come for us for this." She pulled back, her eyes fierce again, and Elias nodded, the weight of her words settling into resolve. "Then let's get the tablet and run," he said, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer before he turned to the pod. They moved quickly, retrieving the bio-crystal from the chamber below, its surface still pulsing with their combined touch. The forest groaned as they climbed into the pod, the Enforcer's reinforcements closing in, but Elias felt a strange calm. Sirith beside him, their child a living link between species and a fight worth winning. The pod surged forward, cloaking once more, and as they vanished into the forest depths, Elias glanced at Sirith, her veins glowing like a beacon. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and that, he knew, was a victory already won. The pod streaked through the Lumary forest, its cloaking field shimmering as it wove between the glowing trunks, the hum of its bioorganic engines blending with the forest's fading wail. Elias Quran gripped the edge of his seat, the Concord tablet cradled in his lap, its bio-crystal surface pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. Beside him, Sirith Valera guided the controls, her pearlescent skin aglow in the dim light, those vivid red veins threading her body flaring with each sharp turn. Her hair, black with crimson streaks, coiled around the console, tendrils moving with a precision that still unnerved him, and the tight confines of the pod pressed their shoulders together, her warmth seeping into him with every jolt. The revelation of their child, a fusion of human and Zyran, burned in his mind, a tether that made the danger feel both more real and strangely distant. "They're gaining," Sirith said, her voice taut as she glanced at a holographic display flickering above the controls. Red dots pulsed behind them, the Enforcer's pursuit relentless despite the energy cascade they'd unleashed. Her bio-suit clung to her, its translucent patches catching the pod's glow, and Elias couldn't help but notice the subtle swell of her stomach where the veins glowed brightest, a quiet testament to the life growing within her. "The dampening fields are weakening our cloak. We won't stay hidden long." "Then we don't hide," Elias replied, his tone steady as he thumbed the multi-tool settings, switching it to its cutting mode. "We fight smart. Hit them where they don't expect. Can this thing climb?" He nodded toward the canopy, the lattice of bioluminescent leaves shimmering hundreds of feet above. Siritha's eyes widened, then narrowed with a spark of approval, and her hair flared briefly, a tendril brushing his cheek as if in agreement. "Yes," she said, her lips curving into a fierce smile. "Hold on." She yanked the controls upward, and the pod surged, its walls flexing as it ascended through the forest, weaving between vines and branches that pulsed with light. Elias braced himself, the tablet secure against his chest, and felt the heat of Siritha's arm against his, her veins glowing brighter with the strain. The Enforcers followed, their sleek pursuit craft cutting through the lower canopy, energy staffs firing bursts that singed the air behind them. "Get me close," Elias said, leaning toward the pod's hatch. "I'll thin them out." Sirith nodded, her hair coiling tighter around the controls, and she banked sharply, bringing them within range of the nearest craft. Elias popped the hatch, the rush of warm, fragrant air hitting him as he aimed the multi-tool. Its blade flared, a thin beam of plasma slicing through the craft's power core, and it spiraled downward, crashing into the roots below. Sirith let out a triumphant laugh, the sound vibrating through him, and he grinned despite the chaos, their rhythm syncing like a heartbeat. "Two more," she called, swerving to dodge a blast that grazed the pod's side, the cloaking field flickering. Elias fired again, disabling another craft, but the third closed in, its staff charging for a direct hit. Scifi twisted the controls, the pod rolling mid-air, and Elias grabbed her shoulder to steady himself, his hand landing where her veins pulsed hottest. The contact sent a jolt through him, her glow flaring under his touch, and she glanced at him, her emerald eyes sharp with something that wasn't just adrenaline. "Nice grip," she teased, her voice low despite the roar of the chase, and Elias felt his face heat, the tension between them flaring even as the forest burned around them. He released her, refocusing on the last craft, and fired a final shot, the plasma beam striking true. The Enforcer vessel plummeted, and Scifi leveled the pod, its cloak stabilizing as they soared into the upper canopy, the pursuit fading into silence. Elias slumped back, the hatch sealing with a soft hiss, and Scifi exhaled, her hair settling around her shoulders as the pod slowed. "We're clear," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with relief. She turned to him, her eyes locking on his, and the glow of her veins pulsed steadily, illuminating the tight space. "You're good in a fight, Elias Caron. Better than I expected." "Had to be," he said, managing a grin despite the ache in his shoulder. Earth doesn't exactly pamper its survivors. He set the tablet beside him, his hand brushing hers as he adjusted its position, and the contact lingered, her warmth drawing him in. Her hair shifted, a tendril curling toward his fingers, and he didn't pull away, the forest hum echoing the quiet intensity between them. "You're not bad yourself. Those moves were something else." "Practice," she replied, her tone light but her gaze heavy. "And a good partner." She leaned closer, her shoulder pressing against his, and Elias felt his pulse quicken, the memory of her pregnancy announcement mingling with the adrenaline still coursing through him. Her hand rested on his arm, the red veins flaring where they touched, and for a moment he thought she might bridge the gap, until a faint beep from the console broke the spell. "Safe sights ahead," she said, pulling back with visible effort. "We'll regroup there, plan our next move." Elias nodded, the moment slipping away, but the heat of her touch lingered as the pod descended toward a hidden clearing, its walls blending seamlessly with the forest's glow. The safe site was a small outpost nestled in the roots of a towering tree, its interior a blend of biotech and natural design. Crystalline shelves, mossy floors, and a central hologram projecting Zyra's map. Elias set the tablet on a table, its surface still pulsing, while Scifi activated the outpost defenses, her hair interfacing with the controls. "They'll regroup too," she said, her voice firm as she studied the map. "The Council won't let this go, not with what we've uncovered." "Then we take it to them," Elias said, stepping beside her. "Show the tablet you're our child. Force their hand." He gestured to her stomach, his hand hovering near the glowing veins, and Scifi smiled, a mix of pride and defiance in her expression. "Yes," she agreed, her hand brushing his as she adjusted the hologram. "A peace conference. They can't ignore evidence this strong. But we'll need allies." Her fingers lingered on his, the warmth seeping into him, and Elias felt the stakes rise, not just for Zyra, but for them, for the life they'd created. The conference convened days later in Zyra's capital, a sprawling city of biomaterial spires that shimmered under the twin suns. Elias stood behind Scifi at a crystalline dais, the tablet glowing between them, its holographic display projecting the ancient human-Zyran union for all to see. The chamber was packed, scientists, council members, enforcers, all watching with a mix of awe and unease. Scifi's presence commanded attention, her bio-suit accentuating her form, the red veins pulsing with a quiet power that drew every eye. "We stand at a crossroads," she began, her voice resonating through the chamber. "Our species is dying, pure, yes, but fragile. The Concord tablet proves we've survived this before with human blood." She gestured to Elias, her hair flaring briefly, and he stepped forward, the weight of her trust grounding him. And now we prove it again. Her hand rested on her stomach, the veins glowing brighter, and a gasp rippled through the crowd. Elias met their stares, his voice steady as he spoke. I'm no diplomat, but I know survival. Humans adapt. We don't cling to what's broken. You can too. He activated the tablet, its hologram shifting to show their child's genetic sequence, a perfect fusion, and the chamber erupted, voices clashing in debate. Siritha's hand found his, squeezing gently, and the heat of her touch steadied him, a silent promise amid the storm. A council elder rose, his armor gleaming, his tone icy. This is heresy, contamination, not salvation. But Sirith cut him off, her voice sharp and melodic, a force that silenced the room. Heresy, she said, stepping forward, her hair coiling outward. Or progress. Our ancestors embraced change. You doom us to repeat their collapse. She gestured to Elias, her eyes fierce. He risked his life for this truth, for me, for our future. Judge that, not tradition. The elder faltered, and murmurs of agreement rose, the tide shifting. Elias watched Sirith, her strength a beacon, and felt a swell of something deeper. Love, maybe, or a bond forged in fire. The conference stretched on, arguments fading into reluctant consensus, and by the end, a fragile alliance emerged. Zyra would explore human integration, guided by the tablet and their child. Later, they stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the twin suns casting prismatic light across the spires. Sirith leaned against him, her hair brushing his shoulder, and Elias slid an arm around her, his hand resting where the veins glowed brightest. We did it, she murmured, her voice soft with exhaustion and triumph. We did, he echoed, pulling her closer, the warmth of her skin a quiet victory. Her hair coiled around his wrist, tendrils soft and possessive, and he smiled, the future stretching before them. Dangerous, uncertain, but theirs. The Lumari forest shimmered under the twin suns of Zyra, its bioluminescent canopy casting a soft emerald glow over the clearing where Elias Karan and Sirith Valera had made their home. The air was thick with the sweet, resinous scent of the trees, a constant hum vibrating through the translucent trunks as if the forest itself breathed with them. Their dwelling was a marvel of Zyran design, grown rather than built, its walls a seamless blend of crystalline roots and living bark, pulsing faintly with the same green light that bathed the surroundings. Elias stood at the threshold, his multi-tool humming in his hand as he adjusted a glowing vine that served as a makeshift curtain, its tendrils curling toward him like a greeting. His jacket, patched and worn from years on Earth, hung on a branch nearby, a stark contrast to the alien elegance around him, but he felt oddly at ease here, more at home than he'd ever been in the ash-choked ruins of his birth planet. Sirith emerged from within, her pearlescent skin catching the forest's light, those vivid red veins threading her body glowing softly with each step. Her bio suit, now a simpler version tailored for their quiet life, hugged her form, its translucent patches revealing glimpses of the veins that flared brighter across her stomach, a subtle sign of the life growing inside her. Her hair, black with crimson streaks, flowed behind her, tendrils swaying as if alive, and she carried a small crystal vial filled with a luminescent liquid, her latest experiment to nurture the child they awaited. "You're fussing again," she said, her voice a low melody that danced on the edge of teasing, her emerald eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "Habit," Elias replied, a grin tugging at his lips as he set the multi-tool aside. "Earth taught me to fix what I can, even if it's already perfect." He stepped closer, the mossy floor soft under his boots, and Sirith tilted her head, her hair coiling briefly toward his shoulder before retreating. The air between them thickened, a familiar tension that had grown since their escape from the enforcers, now softened by the promise of what lay ahead. They were preparing for their child, a fusion of human and Zyran, a living bridge between their worlds, and every moment felt charged with that unspoken weight. Inside, the dwelling was a blend of their lives, Elias's salvage tools rested beside Siritha's biotech instruments. A holographic display flickered with genetic scans of their unborn child, and a small cradle of woven vines glowed faintly in the corner. They worked together in a rhythm born of necessity and trust. Sirith analyzing the child's development. Elias carving a wooden pendant from a fallen branch, its surface etched with symbols from Earth's forgotten past. The forest seemed to approve, its hum deepening as they moved, and Elias couldn't shake the sense that it watched over them, a silent partner in their new life. Later, as the suns dipped below the horizon, they lay side by side on a bed of moss that pulsed faintly beneath them, its warmth seeping into their bones. Sirith rested against him, her head on his chest, and Elias traced his fingers along her arm, feeling the soft glow of her veins beneath his touch. They flared brighter where he lingered, a gentle pulse that sent a shiver through him, and her hair shifted, tendrils curling around his wrist as if claiming him. "It's strange," she murmured, her voice soft against the forest's hum, "to feel so much life here, after all we've fought for." "Strange, but good," Elias said, his tone rougher than he intended. He turned his head, meeting her gaze, and her emerald eyes, ringed with that fiery red halo, held his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. The warmth of her skin, the faint electric charge where her veins glowed. It was a closeness that felt both alien and achingly familiar, a bond forged in danger and tempered by hope. Her lips parted, a faint flush darkening the red of her veins, but neither moved to close the gap, the moment hanging between them like a promise kept in silence. Beyond their sanctuary, Zyra was changing. The Concord tablet and the child Sirith carried had sparked a revolution. Slow, reluctant, but undeniable. The Council, once rigid in its purity, had opened its archives to hybrid research, driven by the evidence Elias and Sirith presented at the peace conference. Scientists flocked to the forest's edge, their bioships hovering like curious insects, drawn by the couple who'd become the face of a new era. Elias watched them from a distance, his hands buried in the soil as he planted a row of glowing saplings, while Sirith met with the researchers, her voice steady as she shared their findings. Genetic data proving that human resilience could save Zyran fragility. The changes rippled outward. In the cities, biolabs sprang up, their walls pulsing with the same light as the forest, and Zyran children born of hybrid experiments began to show traits Elias recognized. Darker eyes, thicker skin, a stubborn spark that echoed his own. Sirith stood at the center of it, her hair flaring as she spoke to the council via hologram, her suit accentuating the glow of her veins as she argued for integration. Elias joined her sometimes, his human bluntness cutting through Zyran formality, and together they became a symbol, a rugged archaeologist and a luminous scientist, united by a child who embodied their shared future. One evening, a delegation arrived at their home, their pearl-skinned leader bowing stiffly as he offered a crystalline tablet etched with thanks. "You've shifted our path," he said, his voice a hum that grated against Elias's ears. "The old guard resists, but the young see hope." Sirith accepted it with a nod, her hand brushing Elias's as she passed it to him, and the warmth of her touch lingered, a quiet reminder of their role. The forest hummed louder that night, its light bathing the visitors as they left, and Elias felt a swell of pride, not just for himself, but for Sirith, for the life they'd sparked in more ways than one. As night deepened, Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, the forest's glow painting Sirith's silhouette where she leaned against a tree. The twin suns had vanished, leaving only the bioluminescent leaves to illuminate her, their light catching the pearlescent sheen of her skin and the vivid red veins that pulsed across her form. Her hair flowed free, crimson streaks glinting as tendrils swayed in the breeze, and she turned to him, her emerald eyes locking on his with a depth that stole his breath. He crossed the mossy ground, drawn by her as he'd been since that first chaotic meeting, and stopped close enough to feel the heat radiating from her. Her hair moved, a tendril curling around his hand, then tightening as if it were a vow, its softness a stark contrast to the calluses of his fingers. Elias lifted his gaze, tracing the lines of her face, the sharp jaw, the faint flush along her veins, and felt the familiar pull, a cow-cot that burned beneath his skin but never breached the surface. "This is forever, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low, rough with the weight of it all. "Forever," Sirith echoed, her tone a melody that wrapped around him. She stepped closer, her hair brushing his shoulder, and their eyes held. A silent exchange of longing and restraint, a love tempered by the battles they'd fought and the future they'd built. The forest's light pulsed around them, a witness to their unspoken promise, and as Elias tightened his grip on her hand, the tendrils wove tighter, leaving a lingering echo of romance that needed no words to endure.